Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The South China Sea. The battlefield is between the Chinese aggression and its neighbors, several of whom are by treaty attached to the United States. The United States is providing the guarantees, the security guarantees necessary for the Philippines and the Japanese, certainly, and other parts of the Southeast Asia, to stand up against Chinese aggression. But at this point, it is not going well. And the neighbors have decided to take the matter in hand. Good for the neighbors. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me. Gordon is traveling. He's in Colorado, where I'm told that it's Rocky Mountain High. Gordon, a very good evening to you. The neighbors. Does China account for its neighbors? Does it regard its neighbors, Gordon? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John, and it's wonderful here in Colorado. China's attitude towards its neighbors is perplexing because it's a natural thing for the neighbors to band together to protect themselves, and yet Beijing gets really upset, and sometimes you think that they did not anticipate this. So China's reaction is just a marvel to behold because it is so mysterious.
We welcome our colleague Walter Lohman, director of the Heritage Foundation's study of Asia, this part of Asia in particular, Asian Studies Center. Walter, the puzzle here, China's aggression is obvious from this far away. Is it obvious in the region, in the neighborhood, or is this business as usual? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Well, no, it's very obvious to those in the region. The question is what they have at hand to deal with it. You think about their sort of banding together in some sort of military fashion. They're loath to do that begin with, but they don't really have the resources. Compared to the Chinese, they're vastly outgunned. And then on many of the other fronts, like on the econ front, they have mixed motives. So they have, China is a major trading partner, major investment destination or investment source, and they want to keep that going too. So they're not entirely squared away either on how they regard China.
Gordon?
Walter, you make an excellent point about the neighbors being outgunned. But what I thought was interesting is in the last several years, we have seen two very large neighbors of China, Japan and India. Neither of them are South China Sea countries, yet both of them are starting to express interest in that body of water and are starting to indicate that the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is an important interest to both of them. This would seem to me to be very difficult for China because you now have very large countries which do have the potential of actually constraining Beijing in its own backyard.
Well, that's definitely true. It's very important that Indians and Japanese are getting involved and care about it, But you could think of it as their backyard. It's their home field advantage too, and compared to the Indians, especially, they have a vastly greater capacity for putting boats in the water. The Japanese, on the other hand, are probably have the best navy in the region, next to the United States. But they have these other restraints on them, these sort of historical issues and things that always keep them on their back foot. So in the end, you can't, they're not going to come up to snuff, either one of them. The Southeast Asians can't do it. They're trying. It's going to take them decades to build the kind of force they need. That's why you need the United States in there. You need a credible, ready, forward-deployed American force to provide deterrence to the Chinese.
Walter, I want to focus on the Philippines right now because Gordon has lived there and he's looked at the Philippines, and the Philippines turned, if not anti-American, they were out of place in the late 20th century about America's presence, treating it as a colonial power, going over the previous 100 years where America had overstepped its welcome. However, right now, Subic Bay, that was emptied of the American personnel, that looks to be a place where the Philippines is going to build up a resistance, a counterforce. How to characterize this to China? Subic Bay, is that meant to answer China?
It's important. I mean, I think the best way to characterize it would be a presence. I mean, that's what they need to aspire to. They're buying these fighter jets from the Koreans, they're basically trainers to any sort of world-class military. But for the Filipinos, it's just being able to put fighter aircraft in the air. They don't even have a single fighter aircraft until they get these ones from Korea. So similar with its Navy in Subic Bay. Right now, the two biggest ships in its Navy, operational ships, are these two Coast Guard cutters that the Americans have given them over the last few years, and they've refurbished and put in the water. So they've got a long way to go, but again, that's why you need the Americans. We need the Americans with access to Filipino bases in order to establish the presence that they need until the Filipinos can get fully up and running and be able to provide presence for themselves.
Gordon?
Walter, this is important because, the United States has not had a formal naval presence at Subic Bay since 1992, when we were kicked out of there and also kicked out of Clark Field, which is nearby. It seems, though, that the Navy is actually going to get its places, not bases concept actually put in place, with our ships being able to actually dock at Subic. And this is also going to be true at another place called Cam Bay, which happens to be in Vietnam. This seems to be important because the United States is going to have a string of places where the Navy can put in for refurbishment, for rearmament, and the rest of it. And I think that this is going to be an important trend going forward.
Yeah, I agree, especially Subic in the Philippines. The Philippines are generally all in building back with the United States, a relationship, a presence, etc. And so I think that there's a lot that will be done on Filipino bases with American ships. I think the Vietnamese still are a little bit tentative. I mean, you have to. It's easy to get a little carried away with where they are, but they also have a very close relationship with the Chinese, and they are loath to allow the United States as much access as we would like to Cam Bay.
Gordon, I want to press you on this matter of the Philippines because you live there and because you can span this reach of the late Cold War and now the struggles in the 2015. Do the Filipinos resent American colonialism? Is our going back in there politically fraught for Manila?
It is politically fraught. There's a number of different strains of thought in Manila policy circles, and one of them is, it's those damn Americans, which is the reason why we were kicked out in 1992. But I think that what is really happening is their fear of China. China's taking Scarborough Shoal in 2012, China taking Mischief Reef before that. That is overpowering their natural anti-colonial, let's kick out the Americans, we hate them sentiment. So I think that this is a good thing in the sense that Beijing is sort of paving the way back for the United States into Subic and perhaps Clark as well.
A quick question about history, Walter. Once upon a time, the Imperial Japanese were very successful exploiting the suspicion by all of East Asia of American aggression, colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism, Dutch colonialism. Do the Chinese use that today in the neighborhood to say, be careful of the Americans, they're colonial masters?
No, I don't. I think in Southeast Asia it generally rings pretty hollow. I mean, in the Philippines, you always have, 10% or less of the population who you can draw from to get out on the street and have a protest. There's, the universities are filled with socialists and, anti-Americans from going back many, many years that feel strongly about that. But other than that, there's really no one for the Chinese to tap into.
Gordon, and your thoughts, Gordon. Does Beijing use that colonial card against the U.S. to its own people?
Well, they try to use this and say Cold War mentality, which is the phrase that they often employ. It's sort of saying, the United States doesn't need alliances or bases in the region because that's just so 1990s.
Walter Lohman is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributor, is traveling. He's in Aspen, Colorado. I'm John Batchelor in New York.